Hey everyone, my name is Xavier, and in this video we are going to build a front-end application to visualize and interact with our JavaScript blockchain implementation. And here is the end result. It's an Angular application that allows us to see all the blocks on our chain. You can see their hashes, the hash of the previous block, when they were created. And you can click on each block to see what transactions are included. So if I click on block number 2 and I scroll down, I can see that block number 2 contains one transaction. The transaction came from the system. It went to the wallet with address high. It was for 100 coins. We can see the timestamp and we can see whether or not it's been validated. I can also see the balance of a wallet. So here we can see there is the wallet high, and if I click on it, I actually get to see some details about this wallet. We can see its address again. We can also see the balance of that wallet, and we can see all the transactions to and from that wallet. Now, of course, we can also make new transactions by clicking on this button right here, Create Transaction. And then we can make a transaction to any address on our blockchain. So we can make one to the address high 2, for instance. We can make it for 10 coins. And then we can sign and create our transaction, and then it gets added to the list of pending transactions. So these are transactions that are waiting to be included in the next block. And to include them in that block, we have to start the mining process. So we can keep adding transactions, and then we can click on Start Mining, and it will actually mine blocks and add them to our blockchain. Now my difficulty is set really low, so it goes super fast, but you can see that now block number 3 has been created, and I can click on it and I can see that there are 2 transactions in this block. There is one to high 2. This is the transaction that I just made. And there is also the block reward transaction, and it's the system actually rewarding us for the mining that we have done, just like it would happen in a real blockchain. And finally, we also have a small settings page where you can set things like the difficulty, and you can configure what the mining reward is. So you can play around with some of these parameters. So that's an overview what we are going to build in this video. It's a cool little tool that allows you to visualize how blockchain works, and it can even help you explain it to others. Now, obviously, this is going to be quite a long video, so I've split it into multiple sections, and you can see the time code for each of these in the description below. So that way you can jump around to the parts of the video that interest you the most. Now, before we get going, I just want to say that this is by no means a complete blockchain implementation. Like the previous videos, it's just to demonstrate how a blockchain works and to help you visualize the internals. All right, with that out of the way, let's get going. I'm going to hide Safari and I'm going to open up a terminal because we need to install the Angular CLI tool. So to do that, you will need Node.js installed on your system. Now, I already have this installed, but if you don't, just Google Node.js, download the installer, and you'll be up and running in a jiffy. Now, once you have that, we can install the CLI tool. All we have to do for that is run npm install -g and then @angular/CLI. The -g lets npm know that this is a global package that we want to be available for our entire system, and more crucially, that should be available on our command line. All right, once that is done, we can use the ng command on our command line, and we can use it to generate a new project. Now, before we're going to do that, I'm going to go into my desktop because I want our project to be stored on my desktop. And then we can execute ng new, and then we can give our project a name. So we're going to call it SavjeeCoin. I'm going to hit enter. And now the ng CLI tool will ask us a few questions like, would you like to add Angular routing? I'm going to say yes because I want to have multiple pages in this application. Then it asks us which style sheet format we would like to use. You can pick whatever one you like most, and I'm going to pick SCSS. And then off it goes. It will create a project structure for us, and it will install all the dependencies that Angular needs. This might take a while, so I will speed up the video to make it a bit faster. All right, that's done. Let's now go into our SavjeeCoin folder, and I'm going to open it up in Visual Studio Code to check out what the Angular CLI tool has generated for us. So this is Visual Studio Code. It's just my editor of choice. You can use any editor you like. You can use Sublime Text, Atom, whatever. And so in the source directory, we can see that the CLI tool has generated a project structure for us. Now, the first thing that I want to do is I want to open up the index.html file, and I want to use Bootstrap. So there's a few things that we have to add here. In particular, we have to add the Bootstrap CSS style sheet. I'm not interested in Bootstrap's JavaScript code, but I do want to use the CSS because then we have some nice components that we can use and we don't have to design them ourselves. So I'm going to go to Safari. I'm going to navigate to the Bootstrap website and I'm going to click on Get Started. And there is the link to the CSS style sheet. I'm just going to copy that, paste it in my header, and then we can use the Bootstrap components. All right, so let's do that. Let's create the header for our application. I'm going to go in the app folder and I'm going to open up the app component.html. And here you can see there is a bit of a header that the CLI tool has generated. We don't really need this. I'm going to remove it, but I'm going to keep the router outlet because here Angular will inject the page that the user has requested. So if the user goes to the homepage contents will be injected here. If he goes to the wallet details page, then that one will be injected here. So around the router outlet tags, we can actually build a little template that will be reused for all the pages. So on top here, I'm going to add a navbar. Navbars need the navbar class. We're going to make it a dark navbar and we're going to give it a bg dark class as well. Then inside of this one, we're going to create a link with the class navbar brand. And this one won't have an href attribute. And inside this a tag, we will just put SavjeeCoin. We don't really have a logo, so we will just use the text. Now I do want people to be able to click on SavjeeCoin to be able to go back to the start page. And instead we're going to add a router link to this a tag. And this is a special syntax for the Angular router. All right, so let's save the file. Let's open up the built-in terminal of Visual Studio Code. And let's check out what we've built. So I'm going to run ngserve. And this one will now compile all of our TypeScript files and all of our templates, and it will make our application actually runnable. So it says compiled successfully. And if I scroll up, you can see that it's running on localhost port 4200. So if I click on that, there you can see this is the basic template for our blockchain frontend. It's just a nice header with SavjeeCoin here. And this is clickable and it redirects you to the root page of our application. Now that we have this template, we can integrate our blockchain into it. All right, so let's go back to Visual Studio Code. And to interact with our blockchain, I'm going to make a new service in Angular. And this service will be the only place in our code where we will interact with the blockchain. All the components that we will make later on will have to go through this service. Now in Angular, you don't have to create these services manually. You can use the CLI tool. So I'm just going to leave ngserve running and I'm going to open up a new terminal and I'm going to run ng. G stands for generate. We want to generate a service and we want to name the service services/blockchain. And the slash will just create a new directory. There you go, in our app folder. Now we also need to install the SavjeeCoin blockchain itself. So to do that, I'm going to say npm install -- save. We're going to install it from GitHub because I haven't published it yet as an npm package. And then we have to pass along my username, Savjee, and then the name of the project, which is SavjeeCoin. So now npm will go out to GitHub. It will fetch the code for SavjeeCoin. It will download all the dependencies of SavjeeCoin and install it into our project. All right, and when it's done, we can start building our blockchain service. So let's go into services. Let's go and open up the blockchain.service. The other file here is just a test file. And let's start by importing the blockchain class. We're going to say import blockchain from SavjeeCoin/source /blockchain. That might look a bit weird, but then again, it's just because I haven't packaged it up as a proper NPM module. We're also going to import the EC from the elliptic library. And this is just a little tool to generate a private and public key pair, just as we did in the previous video. Then inside our class, we're going to add two properties. We're going to add the blockchain instance, which is going to house a copy of a blockchain, and we can initialize it straight away. So we can say that's just new blockchain. And then I'm also going to create a place to store our wallet keys. So I'm going to say public wallet keys equals an empty array. Why an array? Well, it might be interesting to offer people the ability to generate multiple key pairs and to make transactions between multiple wallets that they own. So that's why I just use an array here, and then later on we can make that a bit more flexible. All right, now in our constructor, we will do some initialization. We will go to the blockchain instance and we will set the difficulty to 1. This will just make it faster to mine new blocks, and this is fine for when you are testing and when you are developing. Then I'm also going to mine the pending transactions. And we want the block reward to go to, let's say, my wallet address. And what I want to do here is I just want to make sure that our blockchain has 2 blocks in it so that we can show them and we can visualize them later on. You don't really have to do this, but this is just nice for testing. And then I'm also going to generate some wallet keys that we can use to make new transactions. So I'm going to say this.generate wallet keys. And then I'm going to define that method below the constructor. So I'm going to say generate wallet keys. And this is going to do the same thing that we did in the last video. So we're going to make an instance of the elliptic curve library. We're going to use the SECP 256K1 curve, just like we did in the previous video. We're going to then generate a new key pair. That's ec.gen key pair. And then we're going to add this key pair to our wallet keys array right here. So we're going to say this.walletkeys.push. And we're not going to push this key object as is. We're going to wrap it in another object. And we're going to say the key object equals our key. And then we're also going to extract the public key. We're going to say that's key.getPublic in hex form. And we're also going to put our private key in there, key.getPrivate, also in hex form. All right, now if we want to visualize all the blocks on our blockchain, we also need a method to get all the blocks from the chain. And again, our service is the only way that our application can do that. So we have to define a new method here. I'm going to call it getBlocks. And this function is responsible for returning this.blockchain_instance.chain. This is the property in our blockchain that stores all of the blocks. That's all we need for now in our service. We'll extend it later on with more features as we need them. Now we're ready to visualize the blocks on our blockchain. So to start, I'm going to create a page, which in Angular is also a component, called the BlockchainViewer page. So in the terminal, I'm going to run ngg. I want to generate a component, and we're going to put it in pages, and we're going to call it BlockchainViewer. All right, then we're going to open up the HTML code for our blockchain viewer. Again, the Angular CLI tool puts a bit of dummy code in here. We're going to remove that. And then we're going to create a container, which is a special class in Bootstrap, which kind of centers your content a bit. And then in here, we're going to make an H1 and we're going to say blocks on chain. And in here, we're going to say each card represents a block on the chain, because we're going to use Bootstrap cards to visualize them. Click on a block to see the transactions stored inside. And then below this paragraph, here we want to show all the blocks. However, right now we cannot show the blocks because our blockchain viewer component doesn't have access to them. So let's change that. Let's go into the TypeScript code of our component and let's inject our blockchain service into this. So I'm just going to go to the constructor and I'm going to add a new parameter here. I'm going to say private blockchain service and I'm going to say that it's of type blockchain service. And notice that Visual Studio Code automatically imports our blockchain service. Now what this will do is it will say to Angular, hey, if you create an instance of blockchain viewer component, you have to pass it the blockchain service. This is called dependency injection. So from the moment this component is created, it will have a reference to our blockchain service and it can use that internally. Then we're going to make a place to store all the blocks in. We're going to say public blocks equals an empty array. And when we make the blockchain component, we're going to ask our blockchain service to put all the blocks into this array. So we're going to say this.blocks equals blockchain service dot get blocks. So now our blocks array will contain all of the blocks in our blockchain so we can loop over them and display them. But rather than writing all that code straight in our blockchain viewer component, I'm going to make another component just to visualize the blocks. So I'm going to go to my terminal and I'm going to say ng generate a component, and we want our component to be in the components directory, and I want to call this BlockView, for instance. All right, so let's open up that component. We're going to open up the TypeScript code, and this component will receive all the details about a block. And a block in our blockchain is just a JavaScript object. Now we're going to say to Angular that this block component will receive that. So we're going to say add input. And then we're going to call this public block, for instance. So when BlockView component is created, we have to pass along a variable for block. And this has to contain, of course, all of the details about that block, the hash, the previous hash, the transactions in that block, and so on and so on. All right, now that we have that, we can visualize our block in the HTML portion. So I'm going to remove the boilerplate code, and I've actually prepared this a bit already. So I'm just going to copy and paste this code right here. Let me make the terminal a bit smaller, and let's quickly go over it. So each block will be visualized by a card component. This is a bootstrap class, so it will be beautifully styled. And as title of the card, we will just show a block. And if that block is the first block on our chain, we will show that it's the Genesis block. Now in the body of our card, we will show the details of that block. So we will show its hash. And here you can see how we do that. So we use these parentheses and we say block.hash goes in here. We will also show the hash of the block that went before this one. We will show the nonce, and we will show when that block was created. Now by default, cards in Bootstrap take up the full width of the page, and we don't really want that. We want our blocks to be displayed side by side, so we're going to give them a bit of additional styling. I'm going to open up the style sheet, and I'm going to say that the card class should have a width of 18 rem, and it has to be displayed as an inline block. And let's also give it some margins so that our blocks or our cards don't stick together. So we're going to say that they have a margin right of 10 pixels. All right, so now we have created a component that can visualize a single block. Now we can use that component in our blockchain viewer. So I'm going to go to blockchain viewer, the HTML code, and I'm going to replace this placeholder right here. And I'm going to say that in this place, I want the BlockView component. And this BlockView component has to be repeated for all the blocks on our chain. So we will say ng_for, and we're going to create a for loop here, and we're going to say let block of blocks. So this is a bit of JavaScript syntax. We are going to iterate over the blocks array, which we have defined here in our TypeScript file. And each item on that array will be stored in a variable called block. And that single block has to be passed along. It has to be given to our block view so that it also knows the details of that block. So we're going to put these in square brackets. We're going to say block equals, and then we're going to use that same variable that we defined right here. All right, let's save all these files and let's go ahead. Let's look in Safari to see what it looks like. And you notice that nothing has really changed. The screen stays empty. So why is that? Well, we are using Angular Router, and right now it's just loading our app component and nothing else. So we need to define a home page in our app routing module. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code. Let's go to our routing module, and up here you have a constant called routes. And this is an array where we can define all the places we can go in our application. So I'm going to define a route, an empty route. So if no path is present, then Angular has to load our blockchain viewer component. All right, let's save that. Let's go back to Safari and see if that has helped. And there it is. We can see that our blockchain has 2 blocks and our front end has generated 1 card for each of these blocks. Now, why 2 blocks? Well, the first one is the Genesis block, and this one was created when we instantiated our blockchain in our service. And then the second block was created when we called the mine pending transactions in our blockchain service. And I said in the beginning that this was just so that we would have multiple blocks on our chain. And we can see here all the properties of each block. We can see the hash of the Genesis block. That Genesis block is the first block, so it doesn't have anything before it. And we can also see that block number 2 points towards the Genesis block as well. The next thing I want to do is I want to visualize the transactions in each block. So if I show you the end result here again, then you can see that if I click on a block, I can see all the transactions in that block. So to do that, I'm going to start by implementing a new component to visualize these transactions, and we're going to call it TransactionsTable. So I'm going to go to Visual Studio Code, and in the terminal, we're going to type ng generate a new component, and we're going to put that inside components / transactions table. And this will create a new folder for our component with the HTML files and the TypeScript files, just like we had before. I'm going to open up the TypeScript file, and this component will need a list of transactions to visualize. So we're going to define an attribute right here. We're going to say add input because it will receive this from another component. And then we're going to call it public transactions, and we're going to initialize it as an empty array. We're going to import the input decorator, and that's it. Now we can start working on the HTML file. So I'm going to open this up. I'm going to remove the placeholder, and I've actually prepared this bit of HTML code because it's quite long. So let me just paste it in here, and let's go over what happens here. I'm going to make the terminal a little bit smaller. So for starters, we will display this paragraph when there are no transactions given to us. So when our array, our transactions array is empty, then we will just show this block has no transactions. And when there are more than 0 transactions in our array, then we will show this table right here. And this table will have a few columns. It will have the number of the transaction. This will just count up from 1. So it will be 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. It will show you from which address the transaction originated, to which address the money went, for how much money the transaction was, when it was created, and whether or not it was valid. And then if I scroll down in the table body, we can see that we create a table row for each of the transactions. So we're looping this part of the template here. And then we're filling in all of these columns. So for the hashtag, we're filling in the index. For the from address, we display the from address from the transactions. So these fields, the from address, the to address, amount, and timestamp, these were all defined in the previous videos when we builded our blockchain implementation, including this method right here is valid, which checks if a transaction was correctly signed. This is something that we actually did in last video. So if a transaction has been correctly signed, it shows a little check mark. And if it's not valid, then it shows this little cross icon. Now that we have this component, we have to use it in our blockchain viewer page. Now, if you remember, I'm going to open up the HTML code here. We are currently showing a list of all blocks on our chain. And now what I want is that the user can click on a block and then see all the transactions within it. So in other words, a block can become active. When you click on it, that's the active block, and then we show the transactions for that block. So I'm going to open up the TypeScript file for our blockchain viewer, and I'm going to make a new attribute here, and I'm going to call it the selected block. And I'm going to set it by default to null, but in the constructor of this component, we're going to initialize it. So in the constructor, we load all the blocks from our blockchain into the blocks array, but we're also going to say this.selectedBlock equals the first block in our blockchain. So whenever this component loads, it will make the first block on our chain active, and then we want all the transactions of that first block to be shown. So to do that, we have to write some front-end HTML. So let's go back to blockchainViewer.html, and below this container here, which again shows all the blocks, I'm going to add a few breaks, and then I'm going to create a new container. And inside this container, let's say we want to create a heading, and we're going to say transactions inside block, for instance. And then here we want to show our transactions table components. So I'm going to say app transactions table. And this component, as we've just defined, it needs an input variable. It needs to receive a list of transactions that it has to visualize. So we're going to give it right here. We're going to say transactions equals, and what transactions are we going to pass along to that table? Well, we're going to pass along the selected block dot transactions. So each block object contains some transactions, and we pass it along here to our transactions table component. Now, of course, with this alone, we will only be able to see the transactions of the first block because we've made that active by default. Now what we want is that if a user clicks on one of these blocks, that block becomes the active block. And then this transaction table should automatically update. So we're going to add a new click event on this object right here on our block view. And we're going to say, if the user clicks on this, we want to execute the show transactions method, and we're going to pass along the current block, or in other words, the block that the user has clicked on. And then we need to implement this method as well. So I'm going to open up the TypeScript file, and we're going to make a new method. And we're going to say that if the user clicks on this block, then we're going to set the selected block to the block that we received here in the parameter. And that's it. Let's now save all the files, and let's go to Safari to see the end result. So as the page reloads, you can now see that we have transactions below our blocks. And you can also see that our Genesis block, the one that we make active by default, contains no transactions. Let's now click on the second block and see what happens. If I click on this, suddenly it shows a transaction. And that's because we have mined the second block in our service. And if you mine a new block on our blockchain, you get the block rewards. And this is a transaction that awards you that block rewards. And of course, I can click back and forth between these blocks. So if I click back on the Genesis block, there are no transactions. And if I click on the first block after that, we can see that there is one transaction inside of it. All right, let's move on, and let's now make a settings page to configure some variables such as the difficulty and the block reward. So to do that, I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to create a new page. So we're going to run ngg components in our terminal, and we're going to generate a new page called settings. All right, let's now open up the TypeScript file for our settings page. And this one will need access to the blockchain service because it needs to be able to set certain parameters. So we're going to ask Angular to inject it here in our constructor. So we're going to say private blockchain service, and that's of course of type blockchain service. Now that we have our blockchain service, we want to grab the blockchain instance, and we want to store that straight in our component itself. So I'm going to make a new field here. I'm going to say public blockchain, and then when the settings page is created, we're going to say this.blockchain equals, and then we're going to ask the blockchain service for the blockchain instance. And that will actually allow us to directly set some parameters. So let's now open up the HTML file and let's create a front end for this feature. Now I've prepared this one again, and let me just paste it in here. It's just a simple container with an H1 that says settings. And then we have two form fields that allow us to control the difficulty of our blockchain and how high the mining reward should be. And these are just standard Bootstrap input fields. They have some classes attached to them. But there's one thing that makes it a bit special, and that's this ng model right here. Now this is not a normal HTML attribute. Instead, it tells Angular that we want the value of this input field to be bound to the variable name blockchain difficulty in this case. And that means that if we change the difficulty in our input field, Angular will automatically write that to our blockchain instance and then the difficulty field inside our blockchain. The same thing goes here for our mining reward. If we type in a higher mining reward, it will automatically store that in this variable right here. But it also works in the opposite way. If we somewhere else in our code, we change the difficulty, then this input field will automatically update to reflect that as well. However, if we want to use ng model, we need the forms module of Angular. And to grab that into our project, we have to add it to our app module.ts. So here in the imports, I'm just going to add one. I'm going to say we want the forms module to be imported. And then I'm going to create a new import here. I'm going to say import forms module from @Angular/forms. So that will allow Angular to use the ng model attribute. One more thing we have to do is we have to add a route for our settings page, because without a route, there is no way to access this settings page. So just like we did for the home page, we're going to open up the app routing module and we're going to add a new route here. We're going to say that the path settings should go to the component settings component. And I forgot a semicolon right there. The final thing we will do is we will have to add a button that can take us to this settings page. And I'm going to put that in our header, which we've defined in appComponent.html. So after our brand, I'm going to create an empty div, and inside of it, I'm going to make a button with the class btn, with the class button outline light as well, to make it look a bit nice. And we're going to say that this button has a router link to /settings. And then the text of the button should be just settings. All right, let's now save all the files we've changed. And let's then go back to Safari to see our changes. And you can see straight away, there is now a settings button here on the top right in our nav bar. And if I click on it, there is our settings page with difficulty and mining reward. So I can change the difficulty. I can set it to 2, for instance, and Angular will automatically write this change to our blockchain instance. So that is our settings page. Let's now implement a way to create new blocks and add them to our chain. Now, as you know from the previous videos, blocks contain transactions. So we must first create a page that allows us to make these transactions. So I'm going to go switch back to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to start by adding a few methods to our blockchain service to facilitate that process. So I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to add a new method called addTransaction. And this one will receive a transaction. And we will just go out to our blockchain instance and we will add the transaction there as well. So we're basically just passing along this request. And then we can make our page. So I'm going to go here in the terminal and we're going to run ng generate component. We're going to put our component in the pages directory and I'm going to call it CreateTransaction. All right, I'm gonna make the terminal smaller again. I'm gonna go to that page and I'm gonna open the TypeScript file to begin with. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to add some attributes right here. Our class should contain a new transaction and it should contain the wallet key of the user that wants to make a transaction. Because if you want to make a transaction, you have to sign it with your private key. And then new transaction, this variable will just store all the details about a transaction. So the from address, to address, and the amount. Then in our constructor, we're going to initialize these variables. So first of all, I'm going to request Angular to inject blockchain service into our class, just like we did before. And then inside the constructor, I'm going to say that the wallet key equals blockchain service.wallet keys. And this is an array, so I'm just going to pick the first key in this array. Now, if you want to make a front end that supports multiple keys, then you probably want to handle that here as well. Then I'm going to add something to the ng-on-init method, because every time this page is being loaded, I want the new transaction variable to be reset. So I'm going to say this.newTransaction equals new transaction. And Visual Studio Code complains here because we have to import that first. So we're going to say import transaction from source, from SavjeeCoin /source/blockchain. And then finally, when the user has filled in all the details for his new transaction, we have to create it and submit it to our blockchain service. So I'm going to make another method to handle that. I'm going to say CreateTransaction. It will receive no parameters. And what this will do is it will first set the from address from the transaction. And in case of a blockchain, you can only make transactions from your own wallet. You cannot spend money in a wallet that you don't control. So we can fill in the from address by using your own public key. So we're going to say this.walletKey.public key. Then we're also going to sign the transaction. So I'm going to say this.newTransaction.signTransaction. And we have to sign this transaction with the key object that we generate here in our blockchain service with this key object right there. So I'm going to say sign transaction this.walletKey.keyObject. If you don't remember, sign transaction is a method that we implemented in the last video. Now our transaction contains all the details that it needs to be submitted to our blockchain. The only thing I need to do is I need to actually submit it. So we're going to say this.blockchainService.addTransaction. We're going to use the method that we defined just a minute ago, and we're going to pass along this.newTransaction. And then finally, when our new transaction has been added to our blockchain, or I should say has been added to the pending transactions, we can clear it up and make the user interface ready for a new transaction. So that's what we're going to do here. As soon as we've submitted the transaction, we're going to reset the new TX attribute so that our user interface is clear again. Now that we have our code, let's build the front end. I'm going to open up the HTML page. I'm going to remove the boilerplate code. And just like the cases before, I've already prepared the HTML code for this page. And let's quickly go over it. We start with a header that says create transaction, then a bit of helper text that says transfer some money to someone. And then we've got 3 fields that the user can fill in: the from address, the to address, and for what amount you want to make your transaction. Now, the from address is bound to your public wallet key and it's set to disabled. So again, you cannot spend money from someone else's wallet. You should only be able to spend money from your own wallet. That's why I have disabled it. Then you can define to what address you want to send your money. This is being stored in the to address of our transaction, and the amount is stored in new transaction.amount. Now at the bottom of our form, we've got a button that says sign and create transaction. And when we click on it, this calls the create transaction method that we have just defined right here. When we create a new page, we of course have to define a new route to make it accessible. So I'm going to go to our app routing module and I'm going to make a new route for this one. I'm going to give it a path new/transaction, for instance. And when that path is called, we want to load our CreateTransaction component. The last thing I'm going to do is to add an entry point to our application header so that we can reach this page, this new/transaction. So I'm going to go to appComponent.html. Here is our header, and in this div right here, after our settings button, I'm going to add a non-breaking space, and then I'm going to make a new button which has the same classes as the one above, so btn and btn outline light. The text of this button will be create transaction, and when we click on it, we want the router link new transaction to be opened. All right, so let's save all the files. Let's go back to Safari to see if it all works. So we're still on the settings page from last video, but notice that now here at the top right, we have a create transaction button. And if I click on it, there is our user interface. So you can see we cannot change the from address. And let's make a transaction. Let's say we want to send wallet address 123 10 coins, for instance. We fill that all in. We click on the button sign and create transaction. And as you can see, nothing really happens. These two fields are now empty again, but our newly created transaction has been added to the pending transactions array. But we cannot see them. They are not visualized in this application. So let's change that and create another page to show all the pending transactions, the ones that will be included in the next block once we start the mining process. Let's switch back to Visual Studio Code and start by changing or adding some stuff to our blockchain service to accommodate this. I'm going to add two methods. First, we want the page of pending transactions to show all the pending transactions. That makes a lot of sense. So we're going to make a method called getPendingTransactions. And this method will just return this.blockchaininstance.pendingTransactions. And the pending transactions page will also allow us to start the mining process so that the pending transactions can be completely added to our blockchain. So we're going to create a method called minePendingTransactions. And this one will call the blockchain instance.minePendingTransactions as well. Now this one expects a parameter. We have to pass along the wallet address that wants to receive the block reward, the mining reward. And obviously when we are doing the mining ourselves, we want us to get that reward. So we're going to say this.wallet keys. We're going to take the first wallet key and we're going to say, hey, send that reward to my own public key. And your public key, of course, is your wallet's address. Now that we've done that, let's create the actual page. So I'm going to make my terminal a little bit bigger here. And I'm going to run ng generate components. I'm going to put it in pages and I'm going to call it pending transactions. All right. Now we're going to open up the TypeScript file for the pending transaction component. And we're going to start by adding an attribute here. We're going to say that this class has some pending transactions. And of course, we initialize it as being an empty array. Then in the constructor, we're going to once again request Angular to inject our blockchain service here. Because what we need is we need to populate this array of pending transactions. So we're going to say that this.pendingTransactions equals blockchain service.get all the pending transactions in our application. And then we're going to create a new method for when the user actually wants to create a new block, when he wants to start, in other words, the mining process. I'm going to call this minePendingTransactions. And all that this method is going to do is to call the blockchain service, and it's going to execute that exact same method. All right, let's now create the front-end code for this component. So I'm going to open up the HTML. and we're gonna put everything in a container, a Bootstrap container. We're gonna give it a header. We're gonna say pending transactions. And here we have to show a list of all transactions that are currently awaiting to be put in the next block. Now I could create a new table here and iterate over all pending transactions, but we actually kind of already made a component to visualize transactions, and we put that on our homepage. So we can reuse that exact same component right here. So I'm going to use our transactions table that we've built in the beginning of this video. And this transaction table, of course, needs a list of transactions to visualize, and we're going to pass along our pending transactions here. This is a great example of reusing our components in multiple places. This is what makes Angular and other frameworks like React so popular. The last thing I'm going to add here is a button that will allow us to start the mining process. So I'm going to say button.btn, and we're going to add btn primary as well. Inside this button, we're going to put the text start mining, and then we're going to say if the user clicks on this button, Angular needs to execute the mine pending transactions method. And that's of course the method we've defined right here in our TypeScript file. Again, our page has to be made accessible. So I'm going to open up our routing file. I'm going to add a new path. We're going to say new transaction / pending, for instance. That should load the pending transactions component. And we're also going to add a button to our header to take us straight there. So I'm going to open up the app component.html. I'm going to add a non-breaking space yet again. And then we're going to create a button with the same classes, outline light. This button will say pending transactions, and we want it to load the router link new transaction / pending. All right, let's save all the files and let's go back to Safari. Now, every time you make a change to your Angular code, your browser actually reloads your entire application. So it actually loses all of the transactions and the blocks that you've made. So we're going to start by creating a new transaction. So we're going to say we want to send money to address 123, for instance. Let's say we want to send 20 coins. We're going to click on sign and create transaction. This resets our form. And now if I go to pending transactions, here you can see that there is our pending transaction. And we can create another transaction if we want to. So let's go back to create transaction. Let's say we also want to send some money to address 456. And we want to send 10 coins to that address. Click it again. Go back to pending transactions. And sure enough, there are now 2 transactions that are awaited to be included in the next block. So let's start the mining to see what happens then. I'm going to click this button right here, start mining. And at this point, we actually would want our application to redirect back to our home screen. Because if I do that, if I go and click here on SavjeeCoin, you can now see that we have a third block on our chain. And if I click on this block, you can see that there are 3 transactions into it. The first 2 transactions are the ones that I made. One to address 123, one to address 456. And then there is a third transaction, which was being generated by the system. And that is, of course, the mining reward that we get because we have created a new block and put it on our chain. So that marks the end of our little project. We created a simple Angular application to interact with the SavjeeCoin JavaScript blockchain. Now, this is by no means very complete, and there are lots of things you could tweak and change to make this a lot better and more user-friendly. The source code of this frontend is available on GitHub as well as a live demo. So if you have suggestions and improvements that you want to add to this project, just go to github.com/savjee/SavjeeCoin frontend, and here you will be able to see all of the code and all of the latest changes along with the live demo, as I just said. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you like this video and follow me on Twitter. See you in the next one.